Good morning and welcome to Rape Crisis Network Ireland's tracking monitoring webinar. And what we're looking at today is what it says in the tin, and we're really delighted to have the guests that we have. We really want to open a conversation about what independent monitoring is and looks like, and what it might then explore, what it might then look like for domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, and what we might be missing in terms of this moment where we're building an infrastructure around domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, a new infrastructure around addressing and preventing this problem. Just as a quick introduction to this, the panelists, I'll introduce them in a moment, but they will be well familiar to you. But in terms of domestic and sexual and gender-based violence, we've had a number. For those of you, many of you already know, but for those of you who may not be so familiar, there is a new agency being built. There's a third national strategy at the moment, under which the big moving part is a new agency and moving everything under the one department, and there being accountability all the way up through to the Minister and the Cabinet Committee. These are all really big changes for our sector and for the issue and for addressing the issue. But the aspect of independent monitoring is one of the things that we're particularly interested in having a further conversation on. The Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality back in June 2021 recommended that there be an independent champion monitoring government activity and our success or failure in this area. We also looked at the same time, there was a government audit, which was part of the Programme for Government. And again, that didn't necessarily recommend, it was looking at the infrastructure and therefore it recommended this agency that is being built at the moment. But it did certainly look at other models elsewhere, and it said that independent monitoring should certainly be something that should be considered. We have the national strategy, and in that there isn't, apart from the element that Ombudsman Niall Muldoon will talk about in a moment, Niall Muldoon, it hasn't got a full independent monitoring mechanism written into the strategy, and so that is not necessarily happening in a way that in a holistic way around this subject at the moment. The Istanbul Convention, which many of you will know, is the Council of Europe Convention we're signed up to, and we're currently being examined on in terms of a country report. Ireland is being examined by the Council of Europe for our compliance with this international set of obligations. And under Article 10, there's and the analysis and the recommendations of the Council of Europe in 2016 around the implementation of Article 10 in the Istanbul Convention, there's a very strong recommendation there that monitoring needs to be separate to implementation and coordination. So the question we have as the RCNI is, do we have sufficient monitoring, independence of monitoring in the structure that we are currently building? Is there an opportunity and should we be building it? And the first question for us really is to open up the conversation and go, what would that look like? What is independent monitoring? And what role and function does it play? And we're really delighted to have three really amazing experts in this area who are going to talk to us about their experience, their learning and their recommendations into the space of independent monitoring, not specifically around domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, although all three have crossed over with our subject area and indeed are actually part of our subject area, but not the whole, but more broadly around the theme of independent monitoring. So in the order that I'm going to call them forward, just give a short presentation each before opening out to questions and answers and a discussion with yourselves. We have first the Ombudsman for Children, Niall Muldoon, and we are really we've been long-term on this road with yourself. We knew you first in Kerry when you were working in child protection with children who had experienced sexual violence and indeed their families. And you have been the Ombudsman for Children since 2015. 2015. So we're delighted to have you and your experience coming along and talking about how that experience has been of independent monitoring and evaluation. The second speaker will be Professor Conor O'Mahony, and many of you will be familiar with him. He has just finished his term as the Child Rapporteur, and that is the government appointed role that reports back to government. And he has just finished that term, and he has had a lot of reflections on that term, its impact, and what it needs in terms of the infrastructure. That might be helpful to make it, to even ground it even better in terms of its impact. So I'm really looking forward to your reflections there, Conor. And last, of course, we have Commissioner Emily Logan, who has worn many hats over the last 20 years. I think we were just reflecting, you first became Ombudsman for Children back in 2003, and then Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and now you are a commissioner within GSOC. So you have. I mean, many would say that you have. I think we can even say that you're an activist, independent monitor. You have been a long time in this space, Billy. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you. So, without any more from me, I will hand you over to Dr. Niall Muldoon. And I'll just let the transitions there in terms of. Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cliona, and thanks very much for setting this up. I'm really excited to be invited to speak here, especially with such a renowned panel of members. What I'm going to do first maybe is just give an outline of the Ombudsman for Children's Office, by way of example of an independent human rights institution. There could be many people here who know it already, but so forgive me if you've heard it before, but I didn't want to assume that the audience had a full understanding of the office either. But I think it's just a good example. The Ombudsman for Children's Office was set up as an independent human rights institution under the Ombudsman for Children Act 2002, and the role is to promote and monitor the rights of children in Ireland. We examine and investigate complaints made by or on behalf of children about the administrative actions of public bodies. So wherever government provides services to a child, whether that's through a school, a hospital, housing, wherever they interact with the government bodies, we can look at the administrative actions in that situation. We're set up to be free, independent, and impartial, acting neither as an advocate for the child nor as an adversary for the local or for the public body. We respect and promote local complaints procedures, and we ask every person to engage with the local complaints procedures before they come to us. And we hope to aim to achieve systemic change that addresses the root causes of complaints. So it's not just fixing one complaint and getting more of the same. We try and fix it at a systemic level as well. And in my work, I'm statutorily obliged to consider the best interests of the child and to give due consideration to the wishes of the child in accordance with their age and understanding. And I also have a statutory remit to promote and monitor the rights and welfare of children. And through that, we do that through a number of actions, one of which was to advise ministers and departments on legislation and policy around children, so that we can take the learnings from complaints and maybe make sure that legislation and policy changes, again, making systemic difference. And the other is to educate children and adults about the rights of children as outlined through the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So again, upskilling people about the rights that they have and the rights that children have. Just to give you a little bit of an example around that, complaints-wise, 2021, 2022 have been the record-breaking years for us in regards to the number of complaints we received. Last year in 2022, we met with over 1,100 children in our office. We provide workshops from third class to Leaving Cert, providing an understanding of children's rights and letting them become aware of their own rights. And considering we didn't start opening up our office till April last year, 1,100 children is fantastic to get that number through. We've also engaged with the Oireachtas on a number of legislations last year. For example, the Education Admissions Bill, surrogacy and mental health. And I would have engaged as part of the independence. I can be called in front of any Oireachtas committee, and last year I was in front of six different committees last year. We also had fantastic events for children with disabilities in Sligo and Limerick, where we had over 2,500 children and their families at events, fun events and educational events in Limerick and Sligo. And we set up a youth advisory panel who consulted on issues to bring to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child as they oversaw, as they reviewed Ireland's progress in regards to that. So that's just a sort of brief outline. And again, as an independent body, my contract and my term of office is signed by the President. I don't report to a government minister. I don't report to a department or to a Taoiseach. My role is to report directly to the Oireachtas Committee. So with that brief description done, I'm going to move a little bit now to today's topic, thoughts on what an independent monitoring body might look like in relation to DSGBV. I suppose there's a couple of introductory points just to clarify where we're coming from. Last year, June 22, the Department of Justice set up this, or published the Zero Tolerance Third National Strategy on Domestic Sexual Gender-Based Violence, and that's to cover from last year, 2022 to 26. And one of the goals of that strategy was to commit to offering a comprehensive, coordinated, authoritative, monitored, and evaluated set of responses to domestic sexual and gender-based violence. Fantastic set of goals. It's a fantastic goal, really clear, really well thought out, and well established ideas. The implementation plan that accompanies the strategy tasks the Department of Justice and the future to be established DSGBV agency with devising a monitoring and implementation framework for the strategy. And as this is the first strategy adopted since Ireland ratified the Istanbul Convention in 2019, it represents a hugely important opportunity to significantly improve the way in which we address DSGBV and bring our approach in line with international human rights standards. So it's a real step forward. Article 10 of that Istanbul Convention requires that the state designate or establish one or more official bodies to coordinate, implement, monitor, and evaluate policies and measures to prevent and combat all forms of violence against women. Similarly, international children's rights standards also identify independent monitoring as an essential measure that the state must take to fulfill its obligations. And the role of the Ombudsman for Children's Office is to consider issues affecting children from a child's rights perspective, and our work in this regard is informed by the relevant international human rights standards and guidance, in particular the UNCRC. And Article 19 of that convention requires the state to take all appropriate measures to protect the child from all forms of violence. And it states that it's an omission by the state when measures to end violence against children are not equipped with sufficient means to monitor and evaluate progress. So therefore, monitoring is an essential in bringing Article 19 into reality for children. So there's a real crossover there and a tie-up between the Istanbul and the UN Convention, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So having regard to Ireland's human rights obligations and to our experience as an ombuds institution with responsibility for promoting the rights and welfare of children, there's a number of features today I want to just take a look at as essential for the body that will be tasked with monitoring policies and measures to address DSGBV here in Ireland. The first one and the key one is independence. The third national strategy has committed to improved high-level governmental and political oversight structures to monitor progress and ensure greater accountability for delivery of actions. And this is very commendable. They're welcome, and that self-monitoring must be built into the process. However, independent monitoring of progress is also essential. The Istanbul Convention doesn't actually prescribe the type of body that should be tasked with monitoring, but GREVIO, which is the independent expert body responsible for that monitoring of implementation of the Istanbul Convention, has elaborated on how states can implement its obligations. It's highlighted that monitoring and evaluation is best vested in one or more separate bodies to ensure objectivity. In its evaluation of Germany last year, GREVIO welcomed the establishment of an independent body at the level of a national human rights institution. And it's also noted that there's other countries like Iceland have established the same type of bodies. And we as a nation, we here in Ireland need to learn from those other jurisdictions around in that regard. We also have much to learn from independent monitoring structures that are already in place here in Ireland. At the OCO, at our office, we are acutely aware of the importance of independence in ensuring a credible, trusted and effective ombuds institution. We, in fact, owe part of our origins to the concerns expressed in 1998 by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child that Ireland lacked an independent monitoring mechanism for children's rights. The legislation that subsequently established us, the Ombudsman for Children's Act, makes it clear that I am independent in performing the functions assigned to me as Ombudsman for Children, and that's hugely important. And that's that presidential signature that makes that difference. So in considering the monitoring framework that should be developed for the third national strategy, we believe that the consideration should be given to the independence of the monitoring body that's established and appointed, and how the independence of that body can be appropriately assured in the context of monitoring actions. So it's hugely important that we are clear about the independence of the body that's set up. The second important piece, and this is where the real workings come in, is it needs to be fully institutionalized with a clear statutory basis and allocation of adequate resources to fulfill its mandate. The independence and effectiveness of independent monitoring body will largely be contingent on the framework that will be put in place for it. As an independent statutory body whose work is underpinned by primary legislation, we understand how important it is that that legislation is clear, and it allows us as an organisation to enables us to do the things we need to do, and that the resources allocated to us are sufficient to allow us to do those functions and effectively discharge them. Grevio states that national bodies should be fully institutionalised with clear mandates, powers and competencies, and should be equipped with the necessary human and financial resources to fulfil that mandate. In this regard, it notes how interministerial working groups or committees, though fulfilling an important role, don't meet that criteria. So we really are clear. It needs to be clear mandate, clear powers, clear competencies, and fully resourced on a human and financial basis. It would be important to examine how appropriate statutory provision can be made. And it's also crucial to have the right enacting or amending legislation that sets out the body's specific functions relating to the monitoring of measures in regards to DSGBV, and also the associated powers and duties that will follow it to discharge those functions effectively. So we need a real clarity there. Questions were raised last month in the pre-legislative scrutiny of the general scheme of the DSGBV agency bill at the Joint Committee on Justice as to whether adding additional functions to bodies that already exist in Ireland would be an effective implementation of Ireland's obligation to monitor measures taken to address DSGBV. Our own experience in the context of the third national strategy highlights the need to have regard to the organisational remit and the allocation of resources when considering the type of body that will take on a monitoring function. Our office was approached by the Department of Justice in 2022 with a request to consider taking up an independent monitoring role with respect to actions concerning children within the third national strategy. We had regard then to looking at our own existing statutory functions as well as the resources available to us when we looked at this request. And as an independent human rights institution, it's crucial that any additional work that we undertake is appropriate to our remit. So having considered what was then a draft strategy, we came to the conclusion that a role to advise, support and monitor actions relating to children under the strategy would be important for us to consider. Despite this being the third strategy of its kind in Ireland, it specifically recognised children as victims of DSGBV in their own right for the first time and includes actions to address its impact on children. It's also the first time that the rights of the child have been referenced in such strategies and that children's voices have a central role. Therefore, we felt that this would be an appropriate role for us under our broad remit to protect and promote the rights of the child. And we believe that our independence from all of the bodies involved in the delivery of the strategy would afford us a position of influence and weight. But as regards resources, though we were eager to assist, we indicated that we would be unable to take on this role within our current budget and staffing. So following assurances that funding would be provided to the OCO to take on the role, we agreed to the inclusion of the OCO in the third national strategy implementation plan in an advisory and monitoring capacity. However, the resources were not forthcoming in the budget for 2023, and we are still in a situation where we don't have a staff or funding to carry out our monitoring role as we come up to the first anniversary of the publication. We're in continuing engagement with the Department of Justice and Department of Children around this, and we hope that will be resolved as soon as possible. The third element to look at here, and that's going to be hugely important in the establishment of a monitoring organisation, is the views of children and organisations working for and with children. Just as important as recognise the children as victims of DSGBV and children's voices within the strategy is respect for children's voices and views in monitoring the implementation of the actions within the strategy. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child urges state parties to provide space for consultation and cooperation with children in the design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of measures to protect children from violence. It also emphasised the need to work closely with the NGOs and child-led organisations in the process of implementation and monitoring. So again, it's a recognition that you can never be all things to all people. You've got to go to the people on the ground who know what's happening and hear directly from them, whether that's the child involved or the organisations that are supporting children through this. So it's really important that there's a close cooperation from that in that regard. Article 9 of the Istanbul Convention similarly requires state parties to recognise, encourage and support the work of relevant NGOs and civil society and establish effective cooperation within these organisations So again, that cooperation of a monitoring agency is crucial. I'm statutorily mandated to establish structures to consult regularly with groups of children discharging my function to promote the rights and welfare of those children. And one of the actions that I have taken to fulfill this duty is to set up a youth advisory panel in 2020 to inform and advise our office about aspects of our work. That youth advisory panel was a very, very important part of our process of reporting to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child last year, when they were doing a review of the state's progress in relation to children's rights. Those young people took a survey of 5,000 young people and also focus groups of 200 young children, and put that together in a report that they presented directly to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child themselves in September of last year. And that really is bringing the voices to the heart of power, and that's what monitoring should be doing. So it's vital that the views of victims and survivors, including children, are obtained and inform the work by the national body to monitor actions to address DSGBV. I'm going to conclude on that point and recognise that I've not painted a picture of a specific organisation or institution that we could do the job, but rather the considerations which must be adhered to in order to bring such an institution into existence for this absolutely vital role for the thousands of Irish people and people living in Ireland, young and old, suffering around the country from this horrible crime. I'm going to thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing from the other two speakers and engaging in the panel later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ombudsman, as ever. We always find you just absolutely nail it for us every time, and I'm just really struck at what you said there around the need for independence, being asked to do that, looking at your capacities, taking on the monitoring of the child, and for the very first time the child in domestic and sexual violence strategies, and then not being resourced yet on it. And I was just talking to somebody earlier just about resourcing, and it's NGOs on the ground, we think we have it hard, but when the Ombudsman for Children is also fighting for resources, it's nice to know that we're not alone in the club, but obviously none of us would like to be in that club. So if I can move on to Professor Conor O'Mahony, can I do some housekeeping first, though, that I neglected to do, which is one, we are recording this. So just in terms of then questions and answers and your engagement, just be aware that it's being recorded. Please do put in your questions now. The questions and answers panel is open, but we will be taking them at the very end. But if you have questions now, please do send them on in advance. So Professor O'Mahony, and just to give you a more complete introduction, I never mentioned, I talked about your ex-role as rapporteur, but of course you are the Dean of the School of Law in UCC. And you have long been working in this area in terms of constitutional rights. And I know one of the standout pieces, apart from the child rapporteur work that you've been doing, is rights within education, and in particular sort of campaigning around the state taking responsibility around the protection of children within the education system. If that's an accurate summation there. So I'm really looking forward to your contribution here. So I'll give you the floor here. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks very much, Cliona. Not quite the Dean of Law in UCC just yet, the Deputy Dean at the moment. So I just, in case my Dean gets word of his replacement, I just thought I'd adjust that very, very slightly.
Apologies, it's okay.
Not to worry. So anyway, listen, thanks very much for the invitation today, and always a pleasure to be in the same space as Niall and Emily, who've been great supporters over many years of all the work that I've done. It's really interesting to compare and contrast the various models that are out there of what independent monitoring might look like and how we've done it to date in Ireland. And the particular experience that I had as Special Rapporteur on child protection is a slightly odd one in a number of ways. And it's one which I think probably, even though it had a reasonable public profile, a lot of people were aware of it, but I think there was also quite a bit of confusion about what the role actually entailed exactly, and you know, it wasn't unusual for people to mix it up actually with the Ombudsman for Children's Office, and there is obviously an overlap between the work and the issues which it's concerned with, but in other ways it's quite different in the way it's structured and the actual work that's done. So like Niall, I'm going to spend a few minutes sketching out what the role actually entailed, and then speak a little bit about some of the pros and cons and challenges associated with that particular model. So the term Special Rapporteur comes really from the UN system. The UN human rights system has a range of special rapporteurs who are focused on particular thematic issues, whether it's human trafficking or sexual exploitation of children or so on. Quite a number of those positions have been held in recent years by Irish appointees, actually, as it happens. But at national level, this idea of a special rapporteur is less common. So it tends to be associated with that international human rights system. And it was borrowed, I guess, in Ireland. It was established in 2006 in the aftermath of a Supreme Court decision in a case called CC versus Ireland, in which the law governing statutory rape was found to be unconstitutional. That led to something of a panic about child protection issues in a number of respects. And there was a number of things which flowed from that, one of which was close consideration of the Constitution, which ultimately in time led into the 2012 referendum. But another part of that was the establishment of this new role of Special Rapporteur on child protection. So Geoffrey Shannon was the first appointee. People will be familiar with Geoffrey. He did it for a number of terms. I've just completed my term, and the current holder of the position is Cian Gallagher, who's a King's Counsel barrister based in London. So the role has a number of key components in the terms of reference. It is a role designed to review and report on national and international developments and law particularly, but also policy in child protection. It is a legally focused role, and the qualifications that are set out in the appointment process are always referred to specifically legal experience. But by its nature, child protection is quite interdisciplinary. So, you know, it's hard to keep the focus completely on the law. Sometimes you do find yourself wandering into less legal spaces at times if you're going to do it effectively. You're also required to examine both existing legislation with a view to potential reform, but also proposed legislation as it develops. And to make proposals to the government for reform of law policy in the area of child protection. So that's at a kind of headline level. And the shape that takes then is that you prepare an annual report. And Niall mentioned the kind of reporting lines there. It's a little bit different for the Special Rapporteur. It's a government appointment. You are appointed by government. It's publicly advertised. There's a competitive process through which you submit an application form and a written piece. Then if you're called to interview, you make a presentation and you were interviewed and so on. And the Public Appointments Board make a recommendation to government, and the appointment is made by Cabinet. Your line of reporting is into the Department of Children. So that's where your reports go, and they're completed. They're submitted to the Department of Children. They are in turn then presented to Cabinet for approval for publication. And once approved, they're laid before the Oireachtas. And I'm going to come back to that publication process a little bit towards the end in the context of the discussion on independence and so on. So there's an annual report, and there's a degree of, I guess, flexibility in that there are certain issues you may be asked to look at, but then there's also a degree of freedom to choose to look at issues which are pressing at the time, which you feel are in need of attention. And then there's also, I suppose, a slightly more prosaic element of it, which involves just the snapshot of what's been happening in the last 12 months and what's coming down the track and so on. So the report is a mixture of just covering what's been going on at a very general level, but then also zoning in on a number of specific issues for more detailed treatment. It's also built into the terms of reference that the government can request that you look at issues in additional thematic reports aside from the more general annual report. So in my 3-year term from 2019 to 2022, there were 3 annual reports, one for each year. But in between those annual reports, I was also asked by government to prepare 2 additional reports, one of which was examining children's rights implications of law reform on surrogacy and assisted human reproduction, and the other of which was looking at revelations around illegal birth registrations and making proposals for how to advance the state's response to the past practice of illegal birth registration. So there was 5 reports produced in total. So that's the main bulk of the work. But there's a lot of other stuff that goes on that's maybe less visible. So there will be a degree of ongoing consultation with government departments as legislation is developed or as reforms are progressed. So, for example, in my term, there would have been elements of that around legislation on the role of the guardian ad litem in child protection court proceedings. There would have been the establishment of the specialist family courts process, through which working groups were established, of which I was a member. Oireachtas committees will frequently invite you to make written submissions and to attend before their hearings, whether as part of pre-legislative scrutiny of legislation or more detailed consideration of issues. For example, the joint committee that was established to look at the issue of surrogacy last year. And then state agencies will sometimes invite you to make submissions or observations on policy reform or working documents that they have under development. TUSLA would obviously be an obvious example of one of particular relevance to the work of the Special Rapporteur, but also HICWA or potentially the court service at different times, depending on what's going on. So as they engage in public consultations, they will sometimes invite you to engage with that. And then more broadly, as part of the Special Rapporteur's role, there's just a more general piece of work of just engagement with the sector. So that would mean being in regular contact with the cognate agencies like the Ombudsman for Children's Office, like the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. You do receive quite a lot of invitations to speak at events, whether it's conferences or seminars or so on, and a lot of invitations from the media. And that, depending on what's going on, you can get quiet periods where you're not in such demand, but then as certain things break, you could have weeks where the media are contacting you every day. So it's quite a bit of activity. It's quite a variety of activity. And the other aspect, which I should mention, is engagement with civil society, because of course there are quite a lot of civil society groups who are working on issues that are relevant to the broad field of child protection. And who will at different times reach out to you and seek to speak to you to highlight issues that they feel are pressing and that should be on your agenda. So that's the range of work involved in being the Special Rapporteur for Child Protection. Now, how it differs from the Ombudsman for Children's Office, there are a number of key differences. One, it doesn't have a statutory basis. It's a government appointment. Essentially, the terms of reference are something which are published on the government website, but which could be changed pretty much at any time. The role, it has been appointed consistently since 2006. But if the government decided not to continue with it, then there would be nothing standing in the way of that. So that's one important difference: the absence of a statutory basis. A second important difference is that the focus is really entirely systemic. It doesn't have an individual complaints mechanism. So that's a very distinct and important difference between the work of the Special Rapporteur and the work of the Ombudsman for Children's Office. So the Ombudsman's Office will look at systemic issues as well, of course, but has that individual complaints mechanism in addition, which is a big and important element of its work. And then the third big difference is the kind of scope and scale of it, whereas the Ombudsman for Children is a full-time appointee who has an office and a staff and support team around him or her. The Special Rapporteur for Child Protection is just one person, and it's a part-time role. So throughout the 3 years, I continued to have a full-time position in the law school in UCC for the whole of my tenure. Essentially, the way it works is that the role is advertised with a stipend. There's a single salary rule in the public service. That stipend couldn't be given to me personally. It was instead given to UCC, and then that was used. In short, the quick version is that I hired a research assistant for 2 days a week, Dr. Elaine O'Callaghan, without whom I couldn't have performed the role. And then I had a very, very slight reduction in my teaching load in UCC, about a 10% reduction in my teaching load with some of the remainder of that money. And that's a very considerable difference. And to come back to that issue of independence, and Niall mentioned the importance that resourcing is not just a question of resourcing; it's also a question of independence. if you want something like this to work effectively, you do need to resource it in a way that people actually have the time and the capacity to do the work. And as I said, this isn't a question of me saying the person doing the role should be paid more. I wasn't paid a penny for my work as Special Rapporteur. It was more about how much time did I have. And the reality was the workload of that role I found was quite a bit bigger than the actual time available to do it. So if you think of all the things I mentioned there earlier on, the 5 reports, I think over the 3 years in total ran to something in the region of 300,000 words worth of material. And that's just the reports, not mentioning all the other aspects of the role. And so really, the amount of time that I had to give it, I had probably about a day and a half a week of my time that I could actually give the role, and that simply wasn't enough. And it snowballed. What I found was that the longer you're in the role, the more work that you have done in the role, the more work that then creates. Everything creates follow-on work. And so, here I am today, nearly a year after finishing, and I'm still receiving invitations to do things on foot of having been Special Rapporteur for a while. And not just today, last week I was in Dublin for something on a similar basis. So it does get bigger. So whoever you appoint to one of these roles, I think what happens is over time is that there are more people who want your time and want to hear from you and want you to participate in different processes and so on. So it grows, and certainly that was my experience, that by year 3 I was a lot busier than I was in year 1. So that issue of simply having enough time is one thing which I think, if you're going to establish an effective monitoring mechanism, you need to resource it to be able to do the job effectively. The other issue which can be tricky about a part-time role that I found certainly was that sometimes there was this question of, well, which hat were you wearing? And so as somebody who before I became Special Rapporteur would have been active in trying to bring my academic research into the public sphere through engagement with processes, through engagement in public debate and media and so on. I found then as Special Rapporteur, there was this question of, well, if I was to continue to do my UCC work in the way I had always done it before, and if I was going to be speaking about something, well, who was I speaking as? Was I speaking as Professor of Law, UCC, or was I speaking as Special Rapporteur? And that blurring of lines wasn't always very helpful, to be honest. I won't dwell on that now, but I can elaborate on that later if anybody's interested in that. Then the whole question of independence versus, how do you on the one hand maintain that rigorous independence, which is really, really important to a role like this, versus on the other hand, how do you do that without isolating yourself? So something I found to be very interesting and challenging was the necessity to maintain relationships with people across the sector in order to make sure that I was fully aware of what was happening and fully engaged with events on the ground. Always acutely aware of the limits of my own knowledge. I knew a lot about one small part of the child protection system, but there was so much other knowledge out there from people, particularly from different disciplinary backgrounds, who often would know lots more about things than I would. So it was really important for me to keep those channels open. But at the same time, you need to remain aloof to some extent if you're going to be independent. So I did find that to be a little bit of a tightrope act. And again, I can say more about that later if people are interested in that. The last thing I'll say, just looking at time because my 15 minutes are coming to an end, is just about the process of publishing the reports, which I think is an interesting point and speaks to that independence question. So if you have an independent monitoring body who were to publish reports on the state of the implementation of a strategy or legal obligations or so on, the question of who controls that publication process, I think, is worth some consideration. So now, Niall or Emily may correct me on this, but my understanding of how things work in the Ombudsman for Children's Office or in IREC is that they largely have control over that question of the publication of their outputs. Whereas I was in a different position where I would write a report which I submitted to government, but publication was something for government ultimately. Now, look, it was always published, and there was never any difficulty with that. What there was very often and typically was very long delays. So between the time at which I would submit a report and the time at which it would be published, it varied across the 5 reports I did. The timeline varied between 5 and 7 months between submission and publication. And that was something I always found difficult to understand and quite frustrating. It meant, in some instances, it meant that the content of the report had been overtaken by events and was out of date by the time of publication. In other instances, particularly the illegal adoption report or the surrogacy report, where you had people affected by those issues who knew that there was a report in the ether and were waiting very eagerly for its publication, and would be contacting me saying, when will this be published? And all I could say is, I've done my work and I've submitted it, but I don't know when it will be published. And that was, I think, very frustrating for those people as well. So that question of the control of the publication schedule, not that it affected the contents of the report in any way, but the timing of it and when the publish button would be pressed, as it were, and the lack of clarity around that, I think, wasn't, to my mind, ideal. It wasn't the best way to achieve the impact you might want to achieve sometimes with those reports. So those are just some reflections on the pros and cons of it. I mean, overall, it was a very interesting role to work in. I think it is very positive that the government established it in the first place and continues to make appointments. And I'm delighted to see that Keelan Gallagher has been appointed now, and she's a really formidable person to be in the role right now. So all of that is really positive. There are examples of where the reports are taken quite seriously, and you can see I guess cause and effect between recommendations in the reports and positive things happening. There are also, of course, by the nature of these things, examples of where that doesn't happen and where a lot of work goes into something for relatively little concrete impact. But overall, I think it's certainly better that we have it than that we don't. I would like to see greater resourcing attached to it for all the reasons we've discussed. And I made that point before I finished in the role. Unfortunately, when it was re-advertised, it was advertised at the same rate as it was when I took it up, without even being adjusted for inflation. So I think there are continuing issues around the willingness to put the resources behind these mechanisms, and it would be important that is fully addressed. So I'll leave it there, but I'll be delighted to take questions later on. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Conor. That's just a really thorough, just laying out of what that looks like, and I'm really struck again, and we're often struck on this, particularly around the child rapporteur role, is that we've been really blessed by the people who have been in that position, because it is far above and beyond, and it's almost like and I hate to say the word vocational piece, but there's a volunteerism about this role, because it is so much bigger than the resources that are ever given to it. And as you then described, the snowballing of it, as you build expertise and you build knowledge and you build the connections. So there's so much more scope for this role. And I think you've described that really, really well. So thank you very much for that. And I have a load of other questions once we get to the end. But I don't want to delay us getting to Commissioner Emily Logan, who has worn many, many hats over the years. And I think I'm really looking forward to your reflection in this space, given your broad range of expertise in this area. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Cliona. And thanks a million for inviting me to join this really important discussion today. I'll try and limit my comments to where I am, and I won't duplicate Niall's very able discussion on the Ombudsman for Children's Office, but maybe just start with telling you a little bit about GSOC and what's coming up, rather than looking at where we are today, just to say to people there's a very significant reform on its way. That's reform of policing and also reform of the oversight structures and the powers of those institutions. So specifically in relation to the discussion on DSGBV, there are two things that might just be useful for you to know or to understand when you're thinking about advising government on any institution that might be monitoring. And the first is the broader definition of abuse of power in this context. And in the new PSCS bill, which is going through the Oireachtas at the moment, if you are interested, the next discussion and debate will be on the 9th of May when it reaches the Oireachtas Committee on Justice. But one of the first things I'd say is that the definition of abuse of power for sexual purpose is now much broader, and I just have it in front of me just to make sure I'm accurate here. And that definition says it means any behaviour by a member of Garda personnel which takes advantage of his or her position. as such a member to misuse his or position, authority or powers for sexual purpose, or the broader piece is, or an improper emotional relationship with any other person. So it's not just, I think traditionally in Ireland, we've fallen into the trap of a hierarchy of abuse with sexual abuse at the top. This is a broader definition that includes other legislation that has happened since. And the other thing to say to you, Niall mentioned that, and it was good to hear, Niall, I didn't realise that you had been approached already in relation to the Istanbul Convention and the gender-based violence strategy and the monitoring of that. But one of the things that we come across in practice in GSOC is in the main, the issue for children. Now, while it is a smaller issue in terms of volume or numbers of complaints, the children who come to us, when they make complaints, they often don't pursue them. So they might make an initial allegation with the support of an advocate, but don't pursue it. So one of the things we recommended to the Department of Justice in drafting this piece of legislation was to allow children over the age of 18 to come to us without parental consent. And that has made its way into the bill. So in the context of receiving complaints from members of the public, in section 1921, we, not when I say we, the new organisation that will be the Office of the Police Ombudsman, will be able to take complaints directly from children over the age of 18 without parental consent. And the reason we suggested that is there are lots of children who don't have parental consent, or beg your pardon, parental support for whatever reason that we don't have time to go into now, but it's important to understand in the context of domestic sexual gender-based violence, the barriers that exist for people in trying to approach state authorities. And for women in relation to our role, if you are the cohort that we obviously investigate are Garda members, so that's 14,000, it's a much smaller part of the cohort of people who commit crimes or violence against women and children. And while it is small, it does affect a group of people who are much more at risk of being unable or feeling marginalized in their ability to say something. So if you're a victim of domestic violence and you are with, or your partner who's the perpetrator is a Garda member, just imagine how difficult that is. And we have seen that internationally. So the purpose of the legislation is to try and open up the scope of the legislation to allow people to come to what will be the Office of the Police Ombudsman. But in terms of this context, I suppose we're just alive to the existing barriers for children and existing barriers in particular for women whose partners may be serving Gardaí. I'm one of, I should have started by saying, I'm one of a 3-person commission. Our chairperson is a High Court Judge, Rory McCabe. My colleague, Hugh Hume, has a background in 31 years in the PSNI in policing. So together we work with our 160 staff in GSOC. And our job is more like the traditional ombudsman role, which is singly to investigate complaints from members of the public, either about criminal allegations that would constitute criminal conduct or allegations that would constitute disciplinary breaches. I have a few little pictures, slides, if that's okay, I'm going to share with you now, just to keep me on the straight and narrow. I'm not as talented as the lads in freewheeling. But in thinking about the debate and maybe giving you some ideas about framing it, I just thought it might be useful just to share with you two of the international, one is the international standards in relation to human rights institutions, and the second is more recently the Venice Commission principles. And while the new agency that you're talking about is not a human rights institution, nor will it be a national human rights institution, it's kind of useful sometimes to think about what are the key things and key principles or standards that are seen to make up a stronger institution. So it's very much about the institution. So this dates back to 1993 to what are called the Paris Principles. And our national human rights institution here was accredited and was examined under these principles to determine what's called our accreditation status for sitting before the UN treaty bodies, which many of the civil society groups in Ireland will be well used to. The first are things that both Niall and Conor have referred to, which is the establishment of the institution in statute, in legislation. And in Ireland, traditionally, that has been in primary legislation, which has been very, very good. That the independence is expressly articulated in that statute. So in setting up the institution, that you can see, you as a member of civil society can look at that legislation and see clearly the line of reporting that Conor referred to, and the strength, in my experience, the strength of an institution has been that articulation in the legislation itself, because there are times when your back will be to the wall and the agency's back will be to the wall. So it is very, very helpful to be able to assert your institutional independence in those moments when things get tough. The other thing we haven't mentioned yet, which is something that the UN, the United Nations Human Rights Office of the Commissioner looks at, is the appointment process for whoever is going to lead, or whoever, whether it's an individual person or whether it's a group of people, to lead this agency. And they are emphatic about an open competition, because if you want civil society, if you want the public to trust in an institution, that there's a lot to be said for an open process, transparency in the appointment of people to these institutions to develop trust at the outset, especially as we're talking about a startup situation. We've mentioned autonomy from government, and you have seen both Conor and Niall asserting on occasions their independence from government, and sometimes that's about leadership. It's not always about legislation. I think I should throw in the leadership piece here, not in Ireland, but sometimes you do, and we have seen it in other jurisdictions. Most recently, we've seen the case of the Russian Children's Commissioner being referred to the International Criminal Court in relation to the deportation of children from the Ukraine to Russia, even though she does deny it. But the individuals leading the organization also matter. In terms of pluralism, if we're talking about a group, in this case, my understanding is that the agency may have a CEO, but if you're looking at a board, so in terms of the governance of the institution, that's where you could possibly get the pluralism, the representation, the trust in the institution at a board level. And adequate resources, both Niall and Conor have mentioned resources, which I cannot do anything but support, and it's great to hear Niall banging away at the resources issue still this many years later. In relation to just closer to home is the Venice Commission. So this is the Council of Europe, and the Venice Commission is really essentially the advisory body to the Council of Europe on constitutional matters. But they more recently have outlined standards that reflect and align very well with the Paris principles. And they did that on the basis largely of what was going on in Poland, that the Warsaw government was essentially exerting its power over independent institutions. We saw the question of the judiciary and some members or a member of our own Supreme Court going over to Poland to support the judiciary there. But also Adam Bodnar, people might know, was the ombudsman, was an outspoken ombudsman. And he started to do work on LGBTQ rights. And once that began, his institution became a target. So the institution itself became a target because of his strength as a critic of government. And he was effectively taken out of office because of his work. That's all to say that we're in a very privileged space, if you like, in Ireland in terms of a liberal democracy where civil society is active, is vibrant. I myself, back in the old days, once upon a time when I was Ombudsman for Children, around the time of the recession, there was a report written, which was called at the time, the Bonfire of the Quangos. And what they were going to do was there was a proposal to merge the Ombudsman for Children's Office with the General Ombudsman's Office. And the people who came to my support and who were the allies in fighting to ensure that the Ombudsman had a voice directly to the Oireachtas on behalf of children were the NGO organisations, were civil society organisations. I put out a call, and within 24 hours, I had 10 non-governmental organisations sitting around our table asking how they could help and how they could support. So I would never underestimate, and Conor has said it as well, while it is a difficult space to navigate when you're institutionally independent, you also understand that there are people working right across the country who have proximity to the people who need you, and how important they are in terms of signposting people to your institution, and also lobbying for and advocating for, which is what you're doing now, for ensuring that the institutions are as strong as they can be. I just thought I might mention some of the institutions that I have come across. Is this, I see, I am sharing, yeah, that's okay, sorry. I just saw, you know, when you see that horrible moment when you see a screenshot of yourself and think, jeepers, they're not seeing the slides, they're just seeing me. is just some of the common models that have come across. And this is about structure. So it's just to give you a sense of some of the things in my time as president of the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions. I also served on the Global Alliance. So that is a group of 107 institutions globally. And this was just to give you an idea of a taster of some of the things that people do in other countries, and maybe one or two things that we did in IREC, in the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. So in the first two, you have the kind of the clear-cut ombuds institution that accepts complaints from members of the public and is an investigative body, which is the organisation that I'm in now. The second is the National Human Rights Institutions. And what emerged after the global crisis around 2008, 2009, what you did see was an emergence of single institutions. So when you look to other jurisdictions, you will see an ombuds institution with a now broader remit to also be the National Human Rights Institutions. Here we have separate institutions, which works really well, where people collaborate across the state. In other places, you might have a single institution with multiple thematic portfolios. The third one then is Niall's institution, is the hybrid institution, where you have the complaints. So you have the investigation role, but then you also heard Niall talk about research, being able to research things where children may not come to the institution. And we know internationally there's a huge underreporting of gender-based violence. There's a huge underreporting in relation to children and violence against children. So hybrid institutions allow you to do other things and other ways of finding out information that may be of concern. And it's fantastic to see the Ombudsman for Children's Office just take participation to such a wonderful level in terms of hearing the views. Niall mentioned children with disabilities, and those institutions have great scope. So what I would say is don't only attach yourself to the idea of people complaining, because in and of itself, it has barriers. State institutions that appear to be lofty institutions, maybe for people who don't have the confidence or the wherewithal to approach those institutions, or maybe in very difficult circumstances where it's really difficult for them to complain. The Rape Crisis Network in Ireland knows very well about the things I'm talking about. Super ombuds, I'm talking here about the Défenseur des droits in France, the Ombudsman for Rights in France, where they have a big, massive institution. And within that, then they have thematic departments, if you like. But the institution itself is independent of government. And then you have the Ombudsman for Children. You've dedicated sections within that Ombudsman institution. In New Zealand, they have their National Human Rights Institution. Each of the commissioners has a specialist portfolio in statute. So you have 5 commissioners, and each of those commissioners, one for race relations, one for disability, one for equality. So they run it slightly differently. And then here in Ireland, when I was in the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, what we did was we used the institution to try and lobby successfully to get to particular roles of things that we thought were very important, where you're using the independence of the institution, the power of the institution, and you're wrapping it around a theme within the institution, which allows you and affords you all of the independence in terms of reporting to the Parliament here in Ireland. And the first was the role of the National Rapporteur on Human Trafficking. There were and there are 15 experts around the table in the National Human Rights Institution here in Ireland. And at the time, we had somebody with very particular expertise in Siobhan Mullally, who was sitting on Greta, the Council of Europe monitoring body. And we pitched to be the organisation who would do the monitoring in that. However, what I would say in support of Niall is the National Human Rights Institution is a differently funded institution, and we had the capability in terms of financial support and individual expertise to be able to do that. And the second one we did was civil society would be very familiar with the UN Convention Against Torture and the introduction of the OPCAT mechanism, the NPM, in relation to independent monitoring of what's coming down the line on the optional protocol. And here what we decided to do was to make a pitch for being the coordinating mechanism. So in the Istanbul Convention, you have the independent monitoring, but you also have reference to coordinating mechanisms. So maybe have an open mind to the idea of coordinating mechanisms when you have multiple institutions with part of the role of the monitor, but not in one single agency. And I will skip, how dare I, Niall, I apologise for even having a slide with the Ombudsman for Children. I'll skip, you've more than ably covered that, but get to my last slide, which is more, this is not theoretical, this is more just subjective. So you can take this with the pinch of salt. This is my own view. But looking at across Council of Europe organisations and looking at some of the organisations globally and what happens here in Ireland, context matters. So while you might see something that you think looks very good in another jurisdiction, it doesn't always work in the jurisdiction or the country that you're in. There are a lot of things that are working really well in Ireland. We have a lot of very strong community development. We have a lot of strong civil society organisations who work together. We have a lot of strong state institutions. And I think it's unlikely that beyond having a dedicated institution, it's about being creative around what else, what other elements of that do you see that could be considered for an institution such as this. Both Conor and Niall have spoken about the importance of independence. What I would say about independence, just in terms of my experience, is the importance of running an institution where your decisions are unfettered. And by that, I mean where you do not feel under political pressure to do something, where you do not have any political interference with what you're doing. In my experience in Ireland, while occasionally you might get a call from someone who's not very happy with what you're doing or what you might have said in media, there has never been, I've had no experience whatsoever of any attempt from across the body politic of any kind of political interference whatsoever. People can tell you they don't like what you said about something, or they don't agree with a policy position that you've taken, which they're perfectly entitled to do. But I have never experienced any political interference. What I would say is, I know that sounds a bit, might sound a little bit hoity-toity to talk about the gravitas of being appointed by the president, but I was very struck back in 2003, 2004, when I was appointed and started first as Ombudsman for Children, about, I know it sounds very basic, but people answering letters and taking what you said seriously. It took me a little while to transition to understanding that if you have a statutory power and an institution with you and behind you, that you must, you really must use the power that you have been given, and understand that when you write a letter, that people actually do take it seriously. And that was my experience. And clearly that's Niall's continued experience in going into the Oireachtas. Niall mentioned being asked to appear before 6 Oireachtas committees. People want to hear what the Ombudsman for Children thinks about certain things. So that's really important. We've talked about the collective efforts, and you're already doing that here today in terms of the Istanbul Convention and independent monitoring. And it's sometimes human nature. You're in a small jurisdiction. There's sometimes a bit of vying for bits of what's coming, but it's trying to put the interests of the people that we all serve ahead of individual interests or ahead of institutional interests, and see how this can be the best and strongest institution it can be for the people that you're serving and the people that you meet. I also think, when I look back on my time in the Ombudsman for Children's office, I did engage in international reporting, but now that I've been at the other side of the Human Rights and Equality Commission, I think maybe I would have done more of it. I was less experienced 20 years ago, but the value of having international actors supporting your position, and then having regional actors. At the time, we had Thomas Hammerberg, was the Commissioner for Human Rights in the Council of Europe, and he was an amazing advocate for children's rights and was a great supporter. But using all of and a civil society, using all of the international and regional mechanisms to full advantage in terms of advocating. And my last one, really, I won't get into enhanced powers, but really talking about leadership and use of soft power. And that's, again, the idea that sometimes by virtue of being in a position, people will ask you to, you heard Conor saying he's still being asked to comment on certain things. is understanding that there is a soft power that comes with running an important agency doing really significant work, and to utilize that, and the importance of the reputation of the institution as it grows, of the friends, the allies in civil society. And when I say creativity, of just, you know, not being afraid or limited by legislation, and understanding it's there as a guidance, and to push the boundaries as much as you can, to do the best that you can. But I think that's probably enough for me, Kina. As my brother said, I could talk bore for Ireland on this, but it's just to say that on a positive note, I think Ireland has had a good experience, and individuals and roles have had good experience. And what you want to do is to set out to support, which is what you're doing, to support the institution, and to think about how you can best do that. So I wish you well in terms of your advocacy on this, and obviously whatever follows, we will all watch with huge interest. And of course, like Niall and Conor, I'm happy to take whatever and join in the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you so very much. I think I certainly had a bit of a masterclass in this. You know, I think one of the things that you pointed out first, you know, the Paris principles are lovely and clear. And then, of course, it's more complicated, you know, because we've all talked about, you know, there's the piece where we go independence, absolutely. But independence in an Irish context, where actually we have a political culture that is really quite amenable here to that independent voice. As you say, Emily, in 20 years, you've never felt like your independence has been interfered with. Where Conor O'Mahony, you don't, you know, the role didn't have a statutory, you know, primary legislation under it, but yet you still, you know, while there are limits. And I suppose that's my first question to you, is really about the, you know, the effectiveness, how you can affect, and to what extent you are, you know, this is a hard line or a soft line in terms of soft power, hard power. You know, the role, and I suppose particularly the rapporteur role, doesn't really have, you know, in some ways is acted upon, you know, it's by the grace of government. They invite you, and you do the work, and they may or may not. So as you said, you pointed out, you don't have control over the publishing of the report, and that report has certainly become, for any of the NGOs in the sector, and I think also probably for a lot of the ombudsmen around you, has become a really important annual event for us that we stake a lot of our stuff on and a lot of our advocacy on. But you don't have control over the publishing of it. And my question on the back of that is, of course, you don't have any control of the implementation of it. And any of the recommendations, again, that's on Grace, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's just the territory you're in. Ultimately, you're not elected by anyone to make these decisions. So we heard a lot during the pandemic, that phrase, the well-worn phrase that NEFIT advises and government decides. And it was no different as Special Rapporteur. My role was to make recommendations, but I wasn't elected to make decisions. So you don't expect that everything you recommend will be implemented. That's just not how the world works. I suppose what you do hope, you hope two things. You hope, in the first instance, you do hope that at least some of what you recommend gets somewhere, because I always felt that at the end of the process, you know, I did want to be able to look back at it and be able to identify some things that happened, not from a kind of egotistical point of view, although of course that doesn't hurt either, but you know, it's what you want to feel that you did the job effectively. And you know, there'll be a sense that if none of your recommendations really landed, that maybe you didn't do a very good job. You know, so sure, maybe it can be partly that it's not being taken seriously enough, but you know, your job is to be influential, and you have to you know, it's not as simple as just saying, oh well, those bloody politicians won't do anything I recommend that they should do. Your job is to try to influence them, so you have to try to bring people with you in that respect as well. So you do hope that some of the recommendations land. More broadly, I think you just at the very least hope that they're taken seriously, because sometimes being influential isn't always about actually getting your way or determining a concrete outcome. It's being part of the conversation, and it's shaping the conversation and helping to bring a spotlight on issues that perhaps might not otherwise have had a spotlight on them. So that's what you're really hoping to achieve. I mean, looking back over my experience of that, it varied really from one issue to another, and it's also too early because things move so slowly. One of the biggest things I learned was just how slowly the legislative process in particular works, and it may be 5 years from now before I really am able to actually tot up a list of here are all the recommendations I made and here are how many of them landed and how many didn't. Because there are so many things that are just up in the air, under consideration, and working their way through the system. But there were, I think, to take two quick examples, the guardian ad litem legislation managed to make some positive progress in aspects of that. Some of the stuff on the illegal adoption report, a lot of that actually, a lot of the recommendations in there were, not all of them, but certainly a lot of them were adopted. So that was pleasing, particularly for the people affected by those. But other examples then where maybe you felt that you weren't always, things weren't being taken as seriously as they might have been. So I did find that, while the Department of Children were very open to engagement with the Special Rapporteur, other government departments, I think there maybe was the sense that that's children's issue, and they were maybe slower to come to the table to discuss things that you wanted to highlight. Or the surrogacy report, which I found very frustrating in the sense that the government commissioned me to write it and then essentially wholesale rejected the recommendations that were in there. Again, that's going to happen sometimes. That is part of the landscape, but you do hope that even where you don't carry the day with the argument, at least you hope that you're at least getting people to pay attention to the arguments you're making, even if they're not ultimately decisive.
And would there be a sense then that if you like, almost the two-step that there is between the rapporteur and the ombudsman, that you can say things that it really isn't in the ombudsman remit to say, but once said, you can then bring out, if you like, the stick that you have, whereas Conor, I suppose, has the carrot, if I can describe it in those very crude terms. Would that be a way to does that make sense to characterize it in that way? And does that work?
Sorry, Cliona, you're asking that stuff that we hear from Conor can be used by us then to progress stuff. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. It's vital, and I think that's part of what Conor's talking about. I'm sure Emily will agree with me, but the two terms I constantly use in here are patience and persistence. This stuff is slow. It's part of the reason I went for a second term is because there's stuff left over, and it's part of the stuff I got credit for, stuff that Emily worked on, and people will get credit for stuff that I work on in years to come. It is way too slow in many cases. It doesn't have to be that slow, but again, it's political decisions, political decision consideration. It's part of while we have a very strong, positive political system and liberally safe at this moment in time anyway, we're also too tied into that 4-year cycle. Whereas when we're talking about, we're trying to make things to work for children's lives or for anybody's lives in regards to changing things quickly. So yeah, I think we can certainly, there's work that Conor has done that we will be building on. There's work that we do that somebody else will build on. But I think, and it's one of the arguments we constantly get about the fact that our recommendations are not legally binding. To get the work done properly, it's about moral suasion. It's about winning the argument with somebody that it's better for you to start doing changes now rather than to be forced into it by legislation. And that's hugely important, but it takes patience. One of the examples we had is regards the work we did in regards to a halting site. We took 2 years to investigate that, but I didn't publish for another year because I needed to spend the time engaging with the CEO and with the council to make sure they would accept the recommendations in the best way they could do it. So that was making it happen, as opposed to getting a big publicity shot, all these recommendations, blah, 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 and then 3 months later it's forgotten. Whereas we bought them into the idea, and that's part of it, and that's where patience is hugely important. But, we know that if we had legally binding recommendations, the first thing that happened, right, when the first letter comes in the door, lawyers would get involved, bars would get involved, and everything gets stuck. So that's part of the reason we work in this way.
Yeah, no, and that's that's the subtlety, if you like, of the influence moving over to. So it isn't that black and white, whereas you have to start there, but actually the work is, as you say, it sounds it's much more slow and collaborative. And I suppose one of the things that I'm also struck with is that you talked about the so-called bonfire, the Quangos piece, Emily, way back, and one of the narratives out there is that a Quango of some sort is unnecessary, is something additional, and is always creeping, is always growing. But on the other side of it, I'm also looking at some of the the work that you're doing from our perspective, and we're going, there's obvious places you need to grow. And I know that the Ombudsman's remit has expanded because gaps have been identified. HICWA, we notice all the time that stuff has been left out, and we're adding stuff to it. So growth is appropriate, and Conor, you talked about the snowballing. And one of the things that I remember we sat on the Oireachtas committee about 5 years ago around family law and child protection. And one of the things that you pointed out was that you had no capacity to speak to anyone who had been through an in-camera process, in terms of you being able to talk about what was happening in there, to know about what was happening in there, and to report on it. So a really big lacuna in terms of your capacity. So that would be an obvious place where you would have growth in the rapporteur's role. So I suppose that's the question of, for all of you, or anyone who wants to take it up, is the growth must be in the system, because actually we're building our specialisation, we're building our knowledge, and we become aware of gaps. But how do we, if you like, communicate that, or what are the limits on that, or what's our discipline around the growth of our powers and our capacities?
I might jump in very quickly just on the specifics of that in-camera rule issue, Cliona, because I was only looking at something about this yesterday, actually, and has been a big issue for quite some time, coming from the academic perspective. We have so little good empirical evidence on what happens in family courts in Ireland, whether that's domestic violence, whether it's custody and access, whether it's, we finally now have a body of evidence growing in the child protection side of things, between the work that Carol Coulter and Maria Corbett are doing with the Child Law Project and some other academic research that's been done. But even that work that has been done in the child protection space has been hampered by the in-camera rule, and there isn't almost any good empirical evidence in other aspects of family law, for the simple reason that researchers, while they can seek permission to sit in on court proceedings and they can interview professional participants, they are not currently permitted to speak to the participants in court proceedings that are subject to the in-camera rule. And that is a massive obstacle to generating a robust evidence base on which to build critical analysis of the system and proposals for reform of law or policy or practice in the future. We are currently looking at the establishment of specialist family courts. There's primary legislation in development to put that on a legal basis. And I think, if we want to really progress issues like this, that legislation should include some kind of reform of the in-camera rule that provides legislative cover for that kind of research to be done in an ethical and appropriate way. But as long as the rule remains this very blanket, ill-defined rule that we have at the moment, we're going to lack quality data on which to do this kind of work in the future.
I mean, it seems to me that if I can reframe the question broader, is that the independence and the monitoring depends on the information you're getting in and the access to information that you have. So research and access becomes a really critical question in terms of your capacity to do your job. And I'm wondering, so then there will be limitations for the Commission and the Ombudsman in terms of where you can go. And where you get your information from, and who's deciding what questions are being asked and what data is being collected. So this becomes a really critical point. Where's the knowledge, where's the information, and how do you access it? And I don't know if that's something you want to comment on, or if that's.
This isn't a broad comment, but you've reminded me, Cliona, something that I've forgotten to say in relation to the new office of the Police Ombudsman, because while there's no remit at the moment for research, there is an express provision on undertaking research. And there's also a positive obligation to collate data and identify patterns and trends. I know it's only a small piece, but just when you mention it, it's been a huge omission, to be honest, in relation to the current legislation, that we've 18 years of work and we don't have research. So that's why the Ombudsman for Children's Office and the research that you undertake, Niall, is so critical. As is, I don't know if the new agency has any remit for research, but I do think it's a very useful. It doesn't have to be in legislation, of course, as we well know, but it can be useful to encourage an agency to collaborate.
There's also different types of research. I think, Emily, maybe if you talked about what you did with St. Pat's and the fact that you used your powers in an innovative way, I think that's ways of getting information that are on the ground. That's really crucial too. That listening to the voices of people. That work that you did, where you went in and met the young people in St. Pat's institution when they were in prison.
Yeah,
and that was crucial.
And that was largely because we weren't allowed at the time. We weren't allowed to accept complaints from children in detention. So I suppose the point that you're making there, Niall, is even if the legislation's imperfect, that the people working in the institution can find ways. There are other ways of doing it to make sure that you hear people who are affected, whether it's children, whether it's women, whether it's partners affected by domestic violence and gender-based violence.
And how important, because in terms of the independent complaints mechanisms, that is people being able to access you individually. Is that a really critical point of your information in terms of your knowledge and evidence?
Yeah, of course, it's your bread and butter. From our point of view, like last year with COVID, we had over 2,000 complaints for the first time ever, and we learned a huge amount because word of mouth got around. In one weekend, I had over 50 complaints from teenagers about the Leaving Cert, so that really tells you something, and that sparks a movement in a certain direction that I have to go to the Department of Education and talk about something. So they are really the bread and butter, and that's why I always see it as a triangle. We've got the incoming information and issues from children and parents and representatives to our complaints section. That feeds into our legislation and policy section, which says we have issues on this, this, and this. We need to make sure the policies and legislation changes around that. We can inform the department so we can get ahead of the curve. You don't keep this legislation, or you don't bring in a new legislation that makes things worse or keeps the status quo. And then finally, you've got the education and participation, which allows us to hear from children and people in different ways. So that's why we've gone out and listened to young people in St. Patrick's Institution who weren't heard before. We've listened to young people who've been in mental health inpatient units who haven't been heard before. We've listened to people who are homeless, direct provision, and that feeds in as well. So all three of those create an opportunity for us to have all the information we hope we need, and also for the children to get more than one opportunity to talk to us. It's crucial.
Yeah. And I suppose, Conor, was that one of your frustrations with the rapporteur role? Was that individuals, while they did contact you, in some cases, you couldn't even have the conversation with them?
Yeah, it was an awkward and an unpleasant position to be in sometimes, where I did receive emails, letters, phone calls from people who, were, I guess, at the end of their tether sometimes, feeling that they had been around the houses and were getting no satisfaction anywhere. And would contact me seeking intervention to support their case, and it was just something which I couldn't do. And so there were times, where literally, people received either quite a short and curt response from me saying, sorry, I simply can't deal with this, or perhaps in some instances, no reply at all. And that never felt very, very satisfactory, in the sense that, that what they were saying to you was, nobody's giving me any satisfaction. And then you're saying, well, I'm sorry, I can't either. But that was just the nature of the beast. There was really nothing more I could do. The other version of that, which is a little bit different, but and it ties in both with the research piece and with the independence piece, was that sometimes rather than individuals coming to you with their situations, you might receive contact from advocacy groups who really wanted to highlight a particular issue. And now, working in the area of child protection, you may sometimes receive correspondence from somebody, from people in which they would be making at times very serious allegations of child abuse and so on. And the thing was that that's just not something I could action, even in the report, aside from intervening in individual cases, even in terms of highlighting something in a report. Anecdotal evidence where somebody sends you an email, alleging that XYZ has happened is not actionable information. I mean, what I could action was where I had robust evidence that you could stand over. And I mean, the nature of these kinds of situations is that, first of all, there's 2 or 3 sides to every story. Secondly, the system is varies so much. So if you're trying to make observations at a systemic level, which is what my role was, I mean, the truth is that our child and family law system isn't really just one system. It's lots of microsystems. There's such a variation from one area to another. And if you start paying too much attention to one version of a story, you can end up with a very distorting representation of what the reality is, because you're hearing about what happened in one case or what happens in one area and not really the picture from a systemic level. So again, there were times where you would receive correspondence like that, and you had to say, sorry, I can't do anything with that because this just isn't the kind of evidence that I can really use in the work that I do. And, not everybody's happy to hear that. And sometimes people will push back and will be very critical of you for failing to act on an issue that they feel they're bringing to your attention. But again, I think it kind of goes with the territory. I'm not sure there's a solution to that. I think that's just part of the landscape.
Yeah, the other thing that I would say, just in relation to complaints bodies, is that we only get a small part of the picture. So we're not getting a comprehensive picture of all of the women who are victims or survivors of domestic or gender-based violence, nor of children. We know that internationally, we know that nationally, but that doesn't mean that you can't come across. It's like strategic litigation. Even though it's at a different level, you might just get one individual case that throws up a whole lot of questions about the system and how somebody can say, or how you create a culture around somewhere where they feel comfortable or safe where they feel safe to disclose their experience. But I'm very conscious that we've had the CSO data, we have multiple agencies with small parts of it. So there has to be collaboration is an imperative for all of our institutions and individuals.
Mm-hmm. There is a research strand for the new agency, but of course the question is around independence. For us, the question is around independence. So if the agency is dictating the research, or how that co-creation or collaboration happens, where stakeholders are involved in establishing and setting the research agenda. One of the questions, and this might be far too technical, and I would say to those with questions in, I will come to the Q&A, but the 3 panelists here are not necessarily experts in DSGBV, so if they're quite specific around DSGBV, I'm not sure that it'll be fair to them for me to put those questions to them, but I will come to them. One of the questions I would have, again, on the independent complaints mechanism, so that you're getting the caseload through and you're getting the caseload in. If we were, and as I said, this may be unfair to you, in the DSGBV issue, we are talking about such a range of agencies and such a range of public bodies that are engaged for every case. Almost every case has multiple agencies, and all of those agencies should have their own complaints mechanisms, etc. So I suppose there's a bit of me that, and this is maybe further down the line, where I'm thinking, well, at what point and what sort of, and maybe it's already there in the Ombudsman for Children, at what point does the complaint come together to your office when it's gone through all of the other processes? Is that well understood? Is that difficult to communicate? Is that difficult to clarify?
I wouldn't think so. I think that's the standard process across any public agency. Every public agency should have a complaint mechanism. persons take advantage of that complaint mechanism. If they're not happy with the result, then they move to the next stage. And thankfully in Ireland we have a relatively well-established alternative to courts through different commissions or ombudsman for children or ombudsman's offices. So I think that process is well established, and I think in the DSGBV it would probably be roughly the same scenario. You'd have to give local resolution has to be given the chance to fix it, you know, and then you go forward to somewhere more serious. But again, I think it's hugely important that they are a trustworthy, independent, well-resourced police. And again, resources, it's Conor made a great note of that at the start. You know, the more you do, the more you get work to do, and the more you get work to do and you get more resources, it just keeps growing. So I think it is important that we recognize that as we set this up. This is the third strategy, but if we set up this independent monitoring agency, they will grow because we will learn more, people will come forward more, we'll have more to do, and that's the way it should be. That's progress. That's the way you protect your citizens better, is by establishing it, and they will come. And by them coming, we know more to change our system. So I think it's acknowledging that from the start. You don't set them up with a fixed budget that doesn't change for 10 years. You know that you're going to address it slowly over time and give them, you know, work on that way.
Yeah, that's almost the I want to give you the last word on that, but I want to also go to the rest of the panel, and I know that we weren't lining up for the last word, but we have just about run out of time. Just one point of clarification, Emily, on one of the questions. I think you said that it was the under 18s that are now going to be included without parental consent.
Over the age of 16, so 16 to 18. And so most of the teenagers that come to us would be, when they want to come on their own, they tend to be over 16. After that, parental consent up to 16, but once they're 16, they can come without parental consent.
Brilliant, thank you. And I as I say, I think we might need to take the questions that we have in here and deal with them and try to come back to you beyond this panel here. I don't think we can deal with them here. So I'll just invite the panel if you want to do some closing remarks. I think Niall, I think you've probably given us yours, or you may have more thoughts.
Yeah.
But
no, I mean, I think just for me, it is a tremendous breakthrough to put children into this strategy. I've for many years I've just couldn't understand why they weren't seen as victims instead of just witnesses. So that is hugely important. But again, we want to make sure that Ireland doesn't do what they always do, which is write great reports, great strategies, and not follow through on it. We need to be funded from our side. We need to get the resources from our side to do what we can do to help. And I look forward to this being a successful strategy if we put the right things in place and resource them properly.
thank you, as ever. Professor O'Mahony?
Yeah, I mean, that Niall has said more or less exactly what I was going to say, which is the strategy overall. I think I made reference to it in my annual report last year in quite positive terms. You know, on paper, it's a good strategy. The intentions are good, but we do have this tendency in Ireland that, you know, there can be such an implementation gap between what we write down on paper and what we say we're going to do, and then either whether it gets done at all, or if it does get done, how long it takes to get it done. And I mean, just one brief thing to mention in that context that I've encountered on some of the issues that I was working on over the last few years as well, is that part of the issue here as well is we know that elections happen, politicians move on, and that can have a big impact. You know, you get a new program for government, or you get a minister who was championing a particular issue, and they move on, and the priorities change. That's one factor. The other one, which maybe is spoken about a bit less, is that the same happens with the civil servants. They rotate an awful lot in their positions, and as well, people retire or leave the civil service or whatever it is. And certainly, I think, you know, when I think of the kind of the key figures in the relevant unit of the Department of Children that I would have been dealing with when I started in the role, and they're nearly all gone now, and it's only a couple of years later, and that affects things like implementation, because, you know, you get somebody who maybe had a key role in writing a policy like this and would have been really well placed to drive it, but maybe they're not there anymore, and somebody else comes in with different experience, different priorities, and so that is you know, something that we need to think about more generally about how do we get that continuity in implementation, but then also it heightens the need, I think, to try and make implementation a quicker process, because when it takes too long, it almost guarantees that a key person will leave, or there will be an election, or something like that will happen. If implementation is a 5 to 10 year process, which unfortunately it often is, and if you think about 5 to 10 years in the life of a child, you know, in those 5 to 10 years, a lot can happen, and you end up implementing something very, very different to what you started out with. So if you can shorten that timeline and talk about implementing things within a year or two, as opposed to 5 or 10 years, well, then the risk of losing focus or priorities changing or events getting in the way is greatly reduced.
Thank you. And Commissioner Logan, last word.
Determination. That's just stick with it, because the people we all serve need advocates who are going to be relentless. So it's a long haul, and just get in there for the long haul.
Brilliant, brilliant. Listen, thank you all very, very much. As I said, I think I've certainly had a masterclass in this issue, and just the subtlety and all of the context you brought here, really, really important in terms of this conversation. And we have a recording. We'll be sharing this and we'll be sending it out. Thank you very much for your participation today. Much appreciated.
Thank you.